Hello, everybody. I'm Bill Faulkner. I'd like to welcome all of you to the Shore to Sea lecture series. We have one more lecture this month, and that's coming up. It'll be the history of San Miguel Island, the night over adobe. Should be really interesting. We'll have that next month. The schedule is in a flyer at the back of the room with a lot of other brochures back there. And as many of you know, this is the second to the last program that we'll have for the year. And then next year, the Sea to Shore lecture series will just be 3 lectures in the spring, and then we'll have 3 lectures in the fall. So we won't have the exact same schedule that we had up to this point, but we will be playing those. We'll be letting you know what they entail. Now these lectures are taped by CAPS TV, and using their equipment, it will be aired here on our public station and up in Santa Barbara, Channel 17. And you go to their websites to look for the schedule. Okay, so for tonight, we have Hunter Lenihan, a very distinguished researcher from University of California, Santa Barbara. And tonight, he is going to be describing his very effective efforts to link local fishermen, university scientists, and international biologists to help protect, working together to help protect the California spiny lobster and the nearshore rockfish populations. So without any further ado, I'd like you to welcome Dr. Lenihan.
Well, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you for having me tonight. This is a 2-part series. This is the second part. I gave this talk in a version last night at the Santa Barbara Maritime Museum. So I did a little warm-up there, and so I expect this to be a better talk than last night. It wasn't bad last night. I'm excited to present this work, mostly because it's the sort of very intense efforts have been put into the work by 3 of my graduate students, Carla Gunther, Matt Kay, and Jonna Wilson. So I'll be presenting the data and the ideas, the data they collected and the ideas they generated. And the title shown here, Social and Ecological Impacts, Implications of Marine Reserves on Trapped Fisheries. I want to ask a question first. How many of you eat seafood? Raise your hand. How many of you think marine reserves are a potentially good idea for conserving the marine environment in some way? All right. So I think we're all will have some interest in this talk. And excuse me? Yeah. Well, there's some conflict between those two. So let's explore that potential conflict and some of the solutions. The Santa Barbara Channel, as you probably know, is a great place to study human resource interactions. One of the programs in the channel that's focusing so far on ecological issues within the channel is called the Santa Barbara Coastal LTER, or Long-Term Ecological Research Program at UCSB. And it's the idea of that program is to look at how runoff, periodic runoff, from the land, the land use patterns that influence the runoff, and also oceanographic patterns influence kelp forests. This program, like other LTER programs, the 24 others that are found around the world, are trying to integrate more human resource interactions into their research. It's been a focus. Now, their focus has been on ecological processes, but because humans have such an impact on those ecological processes, they're trying to bring in more social science and also human resource interactions. Of course, a place like the Santa Barbara Channel is a great place to study those interactions because it's highly populated and people are out using the resources. In addition, the Santa Barbara Channel, like other coastal marine resources, provide important ecosystem services. And I list those here. Ecosystem services provided by coastal zones, and I've separated them into provisioning services, such as fisheries, aquaculture, pharmaceuticals, and of course petroleum, cultural services such as history and community, tourism, recreation, aesthetics and regulating services such as biodiversity conservation, water quality, nutrient, carbon cycling, and effects on climate. Today I'm going to focus in on fisheries, fishing communities, and also the conservation of biodiversity. The Santa Barbara Channel, and specifically the rocky reefs that provide the habitat for this focal species in the LTER, the giant kelp, also provide the resources for several different types of trap fisheries within our region. Those trap fisheries focus on rockfish, which are caught live and sold to markets live. It's called the nearshore live fish fishery. Different types of prawns and crabs, prawns and shrimp, different mollusks such as the Caledia, and also crabs. The biggest fishery, however, is for the spiny lobster, the California spiny lobster shown here. The species range is over there on the right. It stops about Point Conception. It's an animal that lives in rocky reefs and is a really important predator on other invertebrates, especially these sea urchins and other clams and small invertebrates. It's an important predator. It can be found at really high densities within the reefs because it lives gregariously within the nooks and crannies and caves that the rocks form. So it's really at really high densities in this area. If there was, one of the reasons we see such high densities here is because we don't have many sea otters. And if there were sea otters here, they would probably knock down these populations pretty effectively. But we don't have that predator controlling their densities, that natural predator, so we see high abundances of the species. You might have seen this recently in the harbor. The fishery for the spiny lobster is a trap fishery, as I said before, and it's managed in two ways, with a size limit that, in which you're not allowed to land anything that's 83 millimeters or smaller, under 83 millimeters of carapace length, and that you must fish within a season that just opened last week that extends through March. There isn't a limit on the number of traps that fishermen can use, and so that's why you see lots of traps within the harbor right before the season starts. There's concern amongst the fishermen themselves about the numbers of traps that are being used in this fishery, and in fact they've tried several times to have individual limitation on the number of traps to be used, but the Department of Fish and Game has found some really issues associated with that and have not allowed for a trap limitation. Despite that lack of a trap limitation, or probably because of it, this fishery has actually increased its catch over the last several years. These are data showing the commercial trap landings within tons over the last 75 years or so, so in total California in red and the Santa Barbara region in blue. This is what you might consider a sustainable fishery. It hasn't crashed yet. It may never crash. In fact, over the last several years, it looks like there's been an increase in catch. There is some evidence that the numbers of traps and the effort has gone up as well, and so these increasing trends may be related to also increasing effort. However, this fishery is a lot different than other rocky reef fisheries, such as that for abalone, which have crashed over the last several decades. Of course, this species was fished very hard, but also there was an introduction of a disease, withering syndrome, that has caused wide-scale mortalities of blacks and reds and other abalone species. One bit of anecdotal information is that if the fishery may have an effect on the size of lobsters that are out there and being caught. So this is a picture showing guys in San Diego in about 1950 with massive lobsters, and this is about the average catch or so of guys, at least in the Santa Barbara harbor. So stable landings may be generated by increasing numbers of individuals caught. That's one of the concerns. Folks that are catching these species are having to fish relatively hard, at least in certain areas, to maintain a living. One of the concerns, especially voiced by environmental groups, is the ecological impact of taking lots of lobsters and reducing their size. And this ecological concern is sort of captivated or couched within something called the trophic cascade. And the trophic cascade has to do with the effect of the fishing, the removal of a predator such as spiny lobsters or sheep's head, and their effect on their prey, purple urchins, and the eventual effect on giant kelp. So we know that giant kelp is really important for maintaining biodiversity on rocky reefs because so many species utilize it as habitat. Purple urchins graze the kelp, and spiny lobsters and sheepheads eat the urchins. So when we reduce their number or size, the concern is that you increase the numbers of purple urchins, and in turn, then you drive down the abundance of kelp. There's areas out in the water here that are called urchin barrens, in which at times the storms knock away, drive down, or remove kelp as happens every year. The urchins then recruit into the area and the kelp doesn't recover. So the concern is that this process may be related to heavy fishing of spiny lobster. To counteract some of the effects, the negative effects of fishing, the state of California has, as you know, set up a network of reserves within the Channel Islands National Marine Sanctuary, and those reserves are shown here. These are no fishing areas that are spread out within the northern Channel Islands right offshore. This network was established in 2003, and it's effectively removed 30% of the rocky reef habitat from trap fisheries like this for the spiny lobster. The idea, of course, is that these reserves have a positive effect on biodiversity by removing fishing, so it's an important conservation tool. But the idea also is that in different ways that reserves can have a positive effect on fisheries. And the two processes, of course, we think about this is that when you protect populations from being fished within reserves, that they provide a source of propagules, larvae or young, that then move with currents outside of the reserves where they settle and they grow up and then can be fished, or that the densities or the abundance of the species within the reserves get high enough, they begin to compete too much for food, for habitat, and they begin to spill out or walk out of the reserves where they can be caught. So they would call that spillover of juvenile organisms or adults. Of course, in the California Marine Life Protection Act, there's another set of reserves that are now being designed and will go into implementation early next year, and those are located along the mainland. So the idea here is, the overall idea of the talk I'm giving is to present data and ideas from learning about the impact and the interactions between fisheries and marine reserves from established reserves here, and using that information then to help manage fishing in a system that is going to be influenced by reserves fairly soon. Issues between humans and in the environment are pretty complex to understand, and so how you put together the information and generate questions is always a challenge. One way we've done it is to use this thing called the Conceptual Research Framework from the LTER program, which links socioeconomic issues like human behavior and the outcomes of human behavior with environmental drivers, and these would be long-term press drivers such as potentially the change in climate or fishing year after year, with short-term pulse drivers such as an oil spill or some other catastrophe. Those then have an effect on what we call the biophysical domain, and that would be the structure of natural communities and then their functions. And out of this biophysical domain, then ecosystem services are produced that then we benefit from, and through that influence natural systems. So I've taken that idea and sort of changed it so it reflects more the spiny lobster fishery. and focusing in on policies and laws to sustain the ecosystem, such as the Marine Life Protection Act, how that influences the income and livelihood of fishermen. The environmental driver here we'll focus is on fishing. We'll think about lobster population structure and how they might influence energy transfer, or that trophic cascade I'm talking about. And then the ecosystem service we'll focus in on is the actual catch of the spiny lobster. So let's work around this format here and see what we can learn. The specific policy, of course, in this context is the development and the establishment of marine reserves. So how does fishing influence lobster populations? Well, to address this question, my student Matt Kay went out and focused on sampling with scientific trap sampling inside and outside of reserves to compare the populations. He did that to see the effect of fishing on lobsters and also to understand what happens when you remove fishing in reserves. And he did that with what we call scientific trap sampling inside versus outside of reserves. But this program started in 2004 when reserves were already established. So that we call this sort of after reserve data. To generate before reserve data, another student, Carla Gunther, went into the bowels of the Department of Fish and Game and went through these multiple boxes of what are called lobster logbook data, in which fishermen record where they've caught lobsters that day, where they've set traps, and how many basically they've caught. And she took that information and put it into the computer. And this basically assembled a fishing data that acted as a before reserve data set from about 1979 to 2003. And I'll focus in mostly on 1999 to 2003. The trap sampling was I think, one of the key aspects or interesting parts of this research, because what Matt did is he basically became an intern or an apprentice for the fishery. And he did that for over a year. He had experience as a recreational lobster fisherman, but Chris Miller and Sam Shrout mainly took him out on the boats and over a year taught him how to trap fish, basically like a professional. So his efforts now are considered to be pretty good. He's sort of an average fisherman, at least in the Santa Barbara Channel. So the data then that he collects is thought of to be relevant to the effect of fishing and relevant to fishermen and the information or the catch that they're associated with. This is an ongoing partnership in collaborative fisheries research. We call it Cal Lobster. We have a website that you can look at, and we think it's one of the better ways to start moving forward in developing innovative and potentially less expensive ways to manage is actually working with fishermen on the water with scientists as partners. That kind of collaboration really helps you when you develop, for instance, your sampling design. So Chris Miller went out with Matt Kay and they figured out, okay, what reserves should you sample? How could you get to the different reserves and the amount of time that you have to sample and the cost of moving between different reserves and sampling, and where have we caught lots of lobsters before, and sort of the whole history of the fishery and how you operate on the water was taught to Matt by Chris Miller and other fishermen. They decided that instead of sampling all the reserves, that would be impossible. They focus on 4 different reserves: Carrington Point, Scorpion, Skunk Point, and Gull Island. These were established in 2003. Matt sampled them from 2004 to 2007 in the after reserve period, and then we, as I said, use that fisheries landing data for the before data. At each of the reserves, the idea was to pick reefs within the reserve, sample those with traps, pick one site outside of the reserve but near the border, and then one far away as a reference site. And the idea here is that if you do see spillover, then this would probably be the site that you see it. Matt not only trap sampled, but he tagged lots of lobsters. I'll show you how many later, lots and lots of them, with the idea being that if you tag them there and they spill over, then they're caught either by the fishery or by Matt in areas outside of the reserve. Gull Island was a good example because this was one of the most important lobster fishing spots before the reserves went in. Here are data showing the lobster abundance in traps, the number of legal lobsters per trap, daily average. In reserves, near and far, the sites I've shown you, before using logbook data in the black, and then after in our scientific trap sampling. As you can see, in the before period, we didn't see any difference at all in the numbers of lobsters reported caught in those different areas. We went in, though, with the trap sampling and found that after a 4-year period, there's what looks like a big buildup of lobster populations within the reserves. Not much difference, though, in the catch on the near and the far sites. This is not to be unexpected. This has been seen in many other reserves, single reserves around the world, where spiny lobster relatives are protected from fishing. Usually their populations increase. I'll talk more a little about spillover. The idea here is we haven't seen yet and the influence of this buildup of lobster populations within the reserves on fishing or catches on the outside, indicating we don't have any evidence yet of spillover. These are data showing that there are a lot bigger lobsters within the reserves than outside. So these are the percentage of individuals in each of these size classes, 70 to 140 millimeters carapace length, so a 140 millimeter lobster is a big guy like this, and a 80 millimeter one is about that big. And this shows the difference in the reserves. You have more lobsters in these higher size classes than you do outside of the reserves, and also higher than what we've found within our fishing partners' catch. We meet them back at the dock in what we call port sampling and see what they caught from different areas. And our data matches pretty much what the fishery's getting, so we're pretty happy with our effort. This is probably about 4 years of growth in individuals that are not caught within the reserves. This is an interesting reserve. This is at Gull Island, and we see lots and lots of females here compared to males, and we don't know why. Probably during that period of the year when these were caught, the males maybe had moved offshore already. We're not sure. So we've seen what fishing has a lobster population structure. Let's see how fishing influences this trophic cascade. This is a really interesting idea presented originally by someone who works in this building, I believe, a friend of mine, Kevin Lafferty, in which he used diver counts and urchin counts and estimates of giant kelp density from the National Park Service kelp forest monitoring program. And he looked inside the Anecdotal Reserve and areas outside and found that, yes, where there's fishing, there's fewer lobsters. In the reserves, there were more. That inside the reserves, there were fewer urchins than there were outside, where there was lobster fishing. And then the association of lower amounts of kelp versus those inside reserves. So this is evidence that the trophic cascade is operative in the areas that he looked. One of the issues we had with this information was they were also the lobsters were counted in diver counts, and it's a pretty cryptic organism, and it's hard to find those at some point. So we wanted to repeat this using the trap sampling that we were sort of have focused on. It's a really important issue because this paper and these data are cited extensively as an important reason to reduce fishing efforts on lobsters. So our idea was to go out, try to redo this study, but not do it within a reserve, do it across a range of different fishing levels outside of reserves. To do that, Carla Gunther basically put together a synthesis of LTER time series data showing densities of urchins versus kelp, and also the lobster logbook landings. She put those together and then did this regression analysis. The statistical analysis that she produced basically showed that 3 of the 8 sites that she had data for showed that there was this evidence of a cascade. And this is only a statistical relationship. It doesn't mean causation, but it's evidence for it. That is where there's fewer lobsters, there's many urchins, and fewer kelp, or less kelp. 63% of the sites, however, showed little evidence of that relationship. Usually there was a relationship between few lobsters or many lobsters and the urchin change in the urchin abundance that you would expect. But there wasn't a relationship with those two levels of the cascade with the kelp density. And that pretty much matches what ecologists think about kelp production. It's driven heavily by the availability of nitrogen that allows kelp to grow fast, and also the level of disturbance, storms that rip out kelp. And so a lot of the kelp biologists think that this sort of what we call a bottom-up effect of storms and nutrient availability really have an important effect on driving kelp density rather than the top-down effect of grazing. I think that this is still correlative evidence. We need to do the really cool experiments, but we think that potentially this trophic cascade isn't as prevalent as some may be concerned with. So let's look then at the biophysical domain and its effect on lobster catch. Again, we go back to the lobster logbook data, and what Carla did was to bin that data into before reserves, 99 to 2003, versus after, and then to take the data. You can't see that, but these are geographic blocks, fairly big blocks, in which the fishermen are asked to report their data from in those logbook cards. So she took areas on the mainland that were away from reserves, she took areas on the island that were away from reserves, and then she took data from blocks that had reserves in them and compared them through time. And we do this in what we call a before versus after comparison, a before versus after control impact study. And to do that, we take the data from the before period and you average it. There's the average with the standard deviation. That's actually the confidence interval around the before amount catch in tons versus the after. And these are data from the non-fishing area, the fished areas on the mainland and the islands. And you can see that there was an increase in the total catch over that time in the fished areas. But in the reserve areas, around the reserves, there was a decrease in the catch. And the way you determine the overall effect is you log transform the data because it's population numbers and you have to do that. And then you subtract this from this, this from this, and this from this, and you get this difference. And so what this shows you is the overall effect of the reserves on the catch in tons. And this declined then over the period. So in the areas that we looked at, there was an overall decline in the amount of caught per ton. Now, I would say that this is not unexpected. That if you remove 30% of reef habitat from a fishery, you remove a lot of the biomass and the things that can be caught. And so you do expect to see a decrease, especially over a time period that are about 5 years after the reserves. So what you might hope to see from a set of reserves is this spillover and the adults moving out and the catches around the reserves getting higher. You don't see actually in the data. Part of that is that we don't see the spillover. Matt K tagged more than 17,000 lobsters over 4 years. We got so far about 5,000 returns and found that actually that in this really rocky, craggy habitat where there's lots of good food sources and refuge for lobsters, that they don't move very far, especially relative to the reserve size. So we're ongoing looking at these tag returns and to see if the spillover happens at some period. If you think back to my graph of all the amount of lobsters that have built up into the reserves, those populations are going to keep growing through time. So it could be that those populations need to get big enough and high enough over time that they begin then to spill over because they run out of food or they have interactions. Too many lobsters is too crowded and they move out of the reserves. We've done some modeling so far that indicates, though, that there's going to have to be a lot of buildup of lobsters within the reserves because the mortality rate caused by the fishery outside of the reserves is not as high as we had expected. And you have to have a pretty high mortality rate, removals by the fishery, to actually see the effect of the spillover. So it's something that we're going to monitor through time to see when it happens and if so, where. One of the big issues, of course, is that if you're going to see spillover, it's probably going to be near the reserve, and the reserves then have to have good lobster habitat that you're fishing along the edges of those reserves. And in fact, many of these reserves don't have good habitat around the edges. So they're not a focus of where the fishermen are putting traps. In addition, early on in the process of the reserves, when they first came in, somebody put their traps near the edge of the reserves, and waves washed them into the reserve area, and that guy got in big trouble. And so they're really careful about putting traps right near the border of reserves. Okay, let's look at then ecosystem services, the spiny lobster catch, and how it's influenced by reserves and then influences income and issues of livelihood in the fishery. Carla then put together, what she did is there were 41 or so fishermen that we identified. She interviewed 23 of them and had them organize their information about revenue, costs, efforts from periods of 5 years before and after the set of reserves. And then she put into her statistical model the change in the cost of fuel, the change in the background across California of the up and down of the lobster catches through years. And so this controls for all the potential changes and spits out a set of information that I think are pretty interesting. First of all, we found that reflecting the data I showed you before, there's about a 30% decline in the individual catch of fishermen on the islands. Seasonal revenues were about down by 10%. So they were making less money this before versus after time period. Also, we found that there was 8% fewer fishermen because some of the guys left the fishery. We found, interestingly, though, that days fished per fisherman didn't change. They still went out the same number of days. They still used the same number of traps. But what they did, though, is they pulled more traps over a day's period. Now, why were they doing that? Well, probably because they're moving out to new areas where they haven't fished as much, and they're actually pulling their traps to learn about the area. So it's an idea where you're moving to an area to fish, you start to sample and to learn about your habitat more, and that costs you in the number of pulls per day. So averaging all that together, the operating cost per pull, actually, relative to per pull, went up about 50%. And that then was one of the reasons why these revenues went down. It just became a more expensive fishery as they're learning to fish in this new this new environment. What's interesting also about the data is if you look at the last year, revenues went up. And talking to the fishermen, many of them said, we're beginning to learn to fish in these new areas. And so it's a really interesting data set in which your revenue drops, your effort goes up because you're learning new areas, and then you start to learn new areas, and then because they're darn good fishermen, then their revenues go back up. Okay, so I've taken you around this loop, and where are we now? Basically, we're thinking ahead now about what we've learned and what we should do with how can we inform management, what can we talk to fishermen about when these new sets of reserve come in, and basically what did we learn and how useful is this science? If we think about that, this is probably a pretty good way to think about what we call adaptive management. That is, management should be based on trying something, learning, and then changing the way you manage because you learn to manage better. In fact, a lot of management isn't like that. So one of the ideas from this set of work is to start pushing on this envelope about trying to make management more of a learning process. So moving forward with this system that I've showed you. Well, what we want to do is examine the evolution of the fishing behavior, catches, and revenue around the system that I've showed you, and see if spillover happens, and see if guys are recovering their revenue and actually benefiting somehow from the reserves. We're also interested in doing a before versus after assessment of the reserves that are now coming onto the mainland. So I've got students now that are fishing with fishermen along the coast, meeting them at the harbor, and generating a data set that will give us a before versus after assessment of the new reserves. Also, as far as management is concerned, There's movement now within the Department of Fish and Game to do a lobster stock assessment. We're actually doing one in my lab. And what we want to do is then use marine reserves to make that stock assessment process better than it's ever been. And that can be done because you have populations within reserves that aren't fished, and you get a lot of biological information out of that. So for example, stock assessments they're very complicated population biological models that you need certain metrics. And one of them is an estimate of natural mortality. That is how many animals just die because they get old or they get eaten by something. That's a really hard thing to estimate. Fishing mortality, F, another thing that goes into these models, is pretty easy to estimate because you know how much fishing goes on. But we found that you can use a comparison between outside and inside reserves to approximate better this natural mortality, because that's all that's killing, that's all that's changing the populations within the reserves, and therefore you can get a better estimate that you can put in those models. So that's one way to use a marine reserve in a new kind of fishery management. I think there are also other ways to do it that we're exploring collaboratively with fishermen and the Department of Fish and Game, and that has to do with thinking ahead and dreaming and speculating and even simulating ways to manage that are different, that focus in on the information that we're gathering from this exchange of data and this way to get data through fishing. And that is to think about trap limits. What would be the value of limiting traps per person and seeing if you could get more lobsters or the same number of lobsters with less effort. Optimizing the sizes, that is potentially letting big ones go or changing the size of lobsters that you catch each season based on some principle that you would make more money by changing the sizes, and other ideas that are coming up. There's a way to do that in a sort of a less contentious and less sort of scary way than rather actually going out and doing that, but you can do them with something that fisheries biologists have used for a long time. They're called management strategy evaluations. And that is, you can take the data you have, you can create management, you can run these in computer simulations, and you can put in different management like a total allowable catch or something. You apply a harvest within your model space, your computer. Then you simulate, based on the data that would produce, what the population would look like. You sample then that, and you run these simulations over and over. So basically, you can change management within a computer and predict then what might come out. And I think this is a really great way to get fishermen, scientists, and managers in the same room, on the same table, thinking about different ways of managing by running these models together. We don't do that yet, but it's a powerful tool. Another example is I'm going to take from John O. Wilson's work with the nearshore live fish fishery, in which on the islands they're focusing on grass rockfish and cabezon. So here's one of our partners, John Colgate, using a stick. And a stick is a set of hooks that are placed out on the reef in real shallow water. You catch these fish live, you put them in a bucket, and you go out and you sell them. This is what's called a data poor fishery. There's no way to do a proper stock assessment because you don't have enough information. So what happens then is that it's regulated under very sort of cautious principles, precautionary principles. That says, okay, you go and you estimate what used to be there before we started the fishery. That's called a virgin biomass. And then you never allow the biomass to go below 50% of that. It's a big guessing game. So that's the problem with what you call a data poor fishery. You could never do a stock assessment. And what these guys claim is that, wow, there are way more fish out there than you're allowing us to catch. Other people say, no, you're overfishing in these certain areas. So there's this very much of a lot of uncertainty around this fishery that actually has a major impact on the guys fishing. So John went out with John Colgate, Mark Brubaker, Chris Heflinger, and other people, and caught cabezon and grass rockfish within the reserves and outside. And here's some of that data showing, just like lobsters, you get bigger animals within reserves than you do outside. So that they're growing, and so you're not catching them, and they're growing, so you get bigger ones inside the reserves versus outside. Also, this is showing the mean biomass inside versus outside of San Miguel's reserves, South Santa Rosa Island, North Santa Rosa, Santa Cruz Island. More biomass in reserves than outside, and except for that reserve there, a higher catch per unit effort. So reserves have the same effect that they do on lobsters over a relatively short period of time. What's interesting too is that if you look across our region, the Santa Barbara Channel, it's usually more warm water down here because it's warm water coming from the south than it is up here where the cold water is coming from the north. And this is a really interesting mixing zone of low productive water, high productive water, and temperatures. And if you look at the mean size and the size at which, for instance, rockfish reach maturity, it's pretty darn different across that range. So if you then go in and say, we're going to do a stock assessment and use all the data from all these islands and create these models then to manage, you've actually got a lot of different biology going on across the range that isn't taken accounted for. So the idea we're pushing and trying to test is whether or not a group of fishermen that work there can sample with scientists inside and outside of the reserves and use that data then for better management there, and better management there. And the idea is to compare the price, because we think it's probably cheaper to do that than to do these large-scale stock assessments that potentially aren't that useful. In this case, you can't do a stock assessment. The way you do it is these things called decision trees, in which you get data inside and outside. You decide on breaking up the species into little ones, medium-sized ones, or the prime ones and the big ones, and then each year, the fishermen are then deciding whether or not that size fish rose versus the last year, their catches were stable, or they're falling, and with that information, they make a set of decisions of how hard to fish. You don't need to have a stock assessment. You basically use your catch per unit effort, how much you're catching of each size range, and you can then begin to do a decision process that tells you, what your effort's going to be versus what you get back. So this is a decision tree model using marine reserves, and we got a really cool paper about it, and we think it's sort of the future of these nearshore management. So the decision tree model shows it overcomes this data poor process. It's spatially explicit. It takes into account the geographic differences in growth and mortality, and really it's a transparent way for stakeholders to participate in their own management. You do a stock assessment, no one knows what's really there. It's very complicated. So this is a better way to move forward together. So here's the other important fisheries in our area. What we're sort of focused in on in my lab is trying to develop experimental fisheries, fishing in different ways, managing in different ways. That becomes scary and potentially very dangerous for fishermen. So what we're trying to do is generate an insurance policy for research. Where can we go to banks and to big lending companies, find sources of money that they're willing to put up as ways for fishermen, if they decide to go with a new way of fishing experimentally, that if they lose their shirt that year doing that experiment, they will pay for that loss. The other thing that's happening being pushed by Steve Gaines and Chris Costello at the Bren School is to give credit to the fisheries for the development of reserves. That is, if a reserve takes away 30% of your biomass, that should be accounted for, especially when you go for these certifications of sustainability. The MSC certification is a way to stamp your fishery as sustainable, and then you can potentially sell that catch at a higher rate. This is one way, without doing the very complicated and expensive way of getting MS certification, that might provide a credit for the reserves. That brings me to, I think, the most important point, that if we're going to manage our species well, I think we have to have a closer connection with what we catch. And so the big movement by lots of fishermen, I think the forward-thinking guys like Pete Halmay in San Diego, is to start getting local markets more linked with the fishers, so the boats come in, the fish are offloaded, they're sold right there, they're not shipped off to shore, and people have a closer connection. So this local food movement then becomes a local seafood movement. And I think that's really where a lot of this issue is. The consumers got to make the decision of, yes, we're willing to pay a little more because we know it's sustainable, because everybody that's working on this fishery says we're doing it right. So that's what we're kind of moving for, harbor by harbor in Southern California at least. So there's acknowledgements, of course, the guys in the California Lobster and Trap Fishermen's Association, the California Department of Fish and Game, SIMS for providing support, UC Marine Council and Ocean Protection Council for some money, mainly for students, LTR, and of course the U.S. National Park Service for the data that was used in some of the synthesis. With that, why don't you hit me with hard questions and we'll have some fun talking about it. Thank you. Sir.
Yeah, is this data-based fisheries, is this in Alaska using the sustainable fisheries with their salmon? Have they been doing that successfully with their numbers of enumerations? And
they have. There's a lot of I think, you know, when you reach in your wallet, you go to a restaurant, you reach for your wallet for like the Autobahn or the Monterey Bay, set a list that tells you what's sustainable or not. Those are the ones that are certified and not certified. So that certification is on those cards, and it's influencing consumers. So there's many fisheries that have been certified sustainable. If you talk to Ray Hilborn at University of Washington, he says that he's a little suspect that fisheries management is in crisis, in the U.S. at least. He gives about 85% of the fisheries a really high passing grade of being managed well. He says that, you know, we need to focus on where the problems are, and those are in the open ocean, for instance, where there's a lot of unregulated fishing, and it's, you know, it's a big disaster in a lot of places. Yeah, no?
Yeah, I can remember when the marine reserves were created around the islands, and they said that you had to have half of the area set aside for fisheries enhancement possibility, and we only set aside 20%, far less than that.
Yeah.
So does that figure in, or does that make sense, or do you consider that, or is that something that's...
Well, 50%, I mean, when you put out the numbers, you know, it's usually a negotiation. 90%, 10%, and then it begins to move together. I think a lot of my colleagues in environmental conservation, ecological science, sort of create a baseline. 50% is good, and that was generated from a number of models that were published. But whether or not that's the right amount of area to protect is not clear, and it really depends on the different fisheries. I think that, you know, if you could present, the real issue is, where do animals go and make babies? Where are the source of populations? And where do they land and they don't produce babies, called a sink? And if you can identify where a source is, that's where you put the reserve. And the other places, you would have a sink and you could fish. An example, in the salmon fishery around in British Columbia, guys focus really on about 0.01% of the area during periods of the year when they're catching salmon, because the salmon all run the same way through an area, and that's where they target their fishing. So you could make 99.9% of a reserve, it wouldn't make any difference. It's right there where they fish. So it's all dependent. These numbers, 50%, 30%, they're wild guesses in a lot of ways.
In the creation of our local marine protected areas, I'm really surprised that for the spiny lobster that we didn't put a limit on the size. You know, like we have a minimum size, but I mean, why didn't we incorporate a maximum size because of the, you know, exponential offspring that, you know, the older, more large?
I think mainly because it sounds like a good idea, but there's no biological evidence of its impact. And there's a whole lot of reasons, because one is larvae of lobster spend 9 months in the water column, meaning that we could get a lot of the ones that settle here actually come from Baja, California.
Right.
So we've done the genetics up and down the coast, and they look completely mixed up and down the coast. So saving big ones here probably is a good idea, but there isn't enough evidence or biological information in the models, because there's no population models, there's no stock assessment that's been done that says you should do that. We need to move in that direction. It's probably a good idea, guys, and some guys do. They throw big ones back. You can't catch a buried one that has eggs. So that's why the fishing season's a certain way, because you're not influencing then the reproductivity. So it's a good idea. The trick is now, let's nail down why it's a good idea.
So
Because there's a cost, everything's a trade-off, right?
we don't have the science to back that?
No, that's exactly what I mean.
Is that being worked on?
Yeah, it's being worked on. And for instance, the data that we have is some of the better data that's been collected yet. Those are going to, that kind of idea will go into those models, those management strategy evaluations, and hopefully we get some indication of the value of doing that. I think conservation-wise, it's just a good idea to do. No.
Well, along those lines, I think I had an understanding that in Maine, they have in fact studied saving the larger species, and there is a limit.
There is a limit, and they've done that, and they've done a lot of great things, and then there's been some crashes lately in the fishery, and so there's a lot of environmental variation, and there's a lot of trade-offs. So I think in general, there's a lot. You look at rockfish and Steve Berkeley's work, it said, and my former advisor's work with clams. A few big mamas are way more important than thousands of middle-sized mamas, because the amount of eggs that they put out is increases so exponentially with the size of the animal. So there's a lot of biological support for that. But you've got to nail things down when you're doing management. It's a human interaction process, really. Yeah.
In that Channel Islands Symposium, the California Islands Symposium that we were at here a few years ago, there was a fellow that did research on the Baja larva migration, and he said, just like you were talking about, how important that was, and I can't know the seasons that most of the larvae came from down there. But so what is being done in regards to the lobster and in coordination with Mexico in conserving?
It's just starting. It's just starting. We're starting to contact these guys down there. They have a different process, a sort of more community-based approach, with some areas that are sort of, they do catch shares. They have certain areas that are reserves and not, and only certain people can fish them. So they have a different way of approaching management. People are thinking about that here to some degree, but there needs to be better coordination. The point is that we don't have a fishery that's crashed. We have what looks like a sustainable fishery, and we don't have it really managed except for the two ways I have it. So there isn't the incentive right now to go make major changes.
How about there? Is it still stable there?
Yeah, it's still stable there.
So the larvae that's produced here, and you said it floats for 9 months. Do we know where it goes?
No, but we can make some guesses. There's folks that have done work with other larvae, and there's a gyre that forms. Goes different ways during different parts of the year, but if larvae get out into the channel, they can actually be caught in the gyre, and then they probably settle here. There isn't necessarily the transport mechanism that can move them to long distances, but they can go into the gyre north of the islands. They could circle back and land on the islands, or they could get moved in these really complex currents along the coast. So there's probably a lot of retention of the larvae that we have here. And that's why we see such mixed populations. You can't tell. You go out and look at the genetics. A student in my lab did it. You can't tell which animals are from Baja and which are not. They're way too mixed genetically. So there's a lot of
You showed in one of your slides that you weren't really seeing any spillover yet.
Mm-hmm.
Do you have a sense for how close to carrying capacity you are in the MPs and when you might start to see spillover?
We think that it's pretty far from carrying capacity.
Is it? Okay.
Just because they're incredibly gregarious and that there's a lot of food in areas. But like everything, it varies with space and time. So some of the reserves and some of the reefs have a lot less den and ability to saturate with lobsters than others. So we would expect some reefs to show density-dependent movement out of those compared to others. So it's this variability issue. I think it's something we'd like to focus in on. The other thing is they move from inshore to deeper waters even over a season's period. So there is a migration. So it's a little bit complicated, but it's something we're going to focus in on. There's another hand up. You with the curly red hair, did you want to ask me a question?
Where did you go to college?
I went to Pasadena City College. Greatest school in the world. After that, I spent time at Berkeley and then Moss Landing Marine Labs, and then I'm a Tar Heel from the University of North Carolina. So I have a lot of degrees. I needed them all. Yes, ma'am.
How are you able to sell conservation, local conservation, when so much of the catch is exported?
Sell local conservation.
Yeah, for locals to buy into conservation,
It's a
when
good-
so much of the catch is exported, specifically urchins.
Yeah, a lot of it is driven by price
Mhm.
and driven by a whole other layer of folks that are buying them on the dock and selling them to the highest bidder. I mean, it's a complicated process, but one of them is just local markets with a focus on selling what you have, and then the consumers responding and doing well. It's hard sometimes to find lobsters because they're all going to Japan. So where I see the most movement in the actual development of local markets is among fishermen. They're the ones that are pushing, we want our stuff sold here because we want a closer connection with our community and what we're doing. So they're the ones that are going to have to decide, no, we're not letting it shipped over to leave. You can't buy these and sell them to the Japanese. We want them sold here. Well, where am I going to sell them then, guy? Well, then you know, it's a bunch of logistics and details, but it's possible. Yep.
You know, you talked about the trophic cascade between the lobster and the sheephead and the urchin,
Mhm.
and you know, now red urchins, do they impact the purple urchins, and was there a relationship there that you looked at?
Well, they're the ones that are fished,
Right.
and they're also grazing kelp, and so that's purples aren't caught and sold at high rates. So, you know, that's another complicated issue there about what the effect of the fishery is on the urchins themselves. But there are a lot of purples, and they're really important on grazing macroalgae on the reefs.
Okay, so the purples can increase, but you haven't found any evidence that they really damage the kelp.
They eat kelp. They eat them a lot. They have a complex sort of life history that when certain parts of the year the kelp is breaking down and it's senescing and dying, they actually get in cracks and crevices and act like filter feeders. Then when that doesn't work, they'll get out and they'll mow down young kelp and algae. I mean, they're important herbivores. The point is, how much does that herbivory actually influence the kelp, which is recruiting, growing, and doing its thing based on the environmental conditions? So the question is here, what is the relative impact of it being eaten versus how fast it can grow? It's the fastest growing macroalgae in the world and grow up to a meter a year or so. A meter a day, excuse me. It's a complicated issue. I don't have a really good answer for the fact. I think what it is that these issues like trophic cascades, they're really, they sound good and they're important and they have been shown in other systems, and then you find evidence for it, and then they all of a sudden become kind of the paradigm, and you begin to move management because of this one model. But a lot of times then we don't question that model and see how it works over space and time. And I think that's really important in a case where we've got a local fishery and you know that trophic cascade might not be controlling kelp. Yes, sir.
You talked a little bit about some type of insurance for commercial fishermen, and I mean, how successful have you been persuading people in the marketplace about that?
I haven't been, this is a really new idea, but Steve Gaines and our dean is really well hooked in with different sources of money within foundations that are used a certain way for taxes that might be something that you can float for a while as an insurance policy. So it's to be determined, but it's really pricked our fancy. We're fired up about this, and we hope we can do it in the next couple of years.
And then alternatively, what other type of fisheries do you think could be, available to commercial fishermen as alternatives?
where they might go to another fishery.
Or just a different type of fisheries that is marketable, either to American consumers or foreign.
Yeah, there are a lot of species there that we haven't done, we're not targeting. A lot of it, what Pete Halme says, sort of fisherman savant in San Diego, is he says that actually folks can make money doing pretty well by selling small amounts in local markets of different species. So they don't need to have this big focus on one species or not. But certain trap fishermen can go for a whole number of different species and sell them at lower amounts. So it's more of a diversification issue than finding necessarily new fisheries. We might be able to do pretty well with Caledia. There's, I'm always pushing aquaculture of oysters and other things, so alternative markets. But that's a good question. I think I'll produce a slide for the next talk because I've seen something about what is actually sold in a market, and that you don't need to have a huge impacts within each one of those fisheries. You can just produce a few tons each year of all of them, and you make a lot of money. Yeah.
Go ahead.
Yes, sir.
We hear a lot about ocean acidification affecting certain fisheries related to the shellfish in terms of the lobster and its creating habits on urchins and so forth. How does that affect the possibilities of the future?
I don't know. I think it's a pretty tough one to follow. I think we should be concerned about it. Work in the laboratory when you take the larvae of some of these animals like urchins and you change the acidity a little bit, it looks like there's some real problems. And it's certainly a concern in some of the other systems I work in like coral reefs. But then again, and I'm not saying it's not an issue, it's complicated. Around the coral reef, we're also finding that there's a lot of sort of basic, there are a lot of cations and sort of basic water conditions that aren't acidic that could have an impact on overall acidity of the water. So I think it's a big problem. I think it's complicated. And I think if we don't do something about it, we may see the impact on our local fisheries. I'm not concerned over the really short period of time, but something we need to be thinking ahead about. One more?
We're taking a lot of squid out of the channel these days, which is a lot of primary biomass,
Yeah.
which is got to have an effect on the whole chain and all these animals, everything.
Absolutely.
We're taking out more than we have in the past. I mean, there were many years that we weren't fishing squid off the Santa Barbara area or the Channel Islands here. Are we taking into account how that is beginning to affect?
I think it's something that they're trying to manage based on the models that they do with stock assessments and how much you take. I think the real issue is there's no doubt that fishing has an impact on the environment. So does agriculture. And if you're going to go out and fish an area, you're going to change the ecosystem. And where I think the real issues are is to start to figure out, weighing the ecological impact of fishing and the economic gain. And if you go, I highly suggest you all take this note. Ray Hilborn has a talk on the web that you can see, and it's called Reinterpreting the Fisheries Crisis. And he shows some of these big issues between fishing and environmental protection. And a lot of it now we're shifting more to ecosystem protection against fishing. Fishing has always been sort of designed to produce jobs and to be a sort of a growth industry. If we can make it more efficient, then we may be able to have our cake and eat it too. So it's an issue of how do you improve the amount of catches, reduce the effort. You probably drop the number of jobs in the fisheries themselves, but you might increase the individual revenues, and then you generate other ways to generate those revenues throughout the fishery. So these are big issues. There's no doubt taking lots of squid out of the channel is having an environmental impact, no doubt. What it is and whether we're willing to withstand that is another question. People buy it, people need protein from the ocean, there's no doubt about it. I eat squid. The question is, do we want to get it from here? Do we want to get it somewhere else where maybe not as well managed? Do we want to take less because we're worried about the impacts? They're big questions.
Well, squid's the bottom of the food chain, basically, when it,
No, they're important predators.
well, that too, but the dying squid go into the food chain.
Yep, and they're eaten by dolphin and, really important part of the ecosystem. But they're important fishery too.
But isn't there a lot of evidence though, that with the huge major predators that have been overfishing our area, bluefin tuna, the great tuna fisheries we had in the past, that there's evidence that we have more squid now because that has already been affected because we've taken the major predators away that
Less whales and,
So, and same with jellyfish.
same as jellyfish, and we probably have more abalone than we did when we.
But there's already an imbalance.
Yeah. So I think this idea of reserves in certain places to try to reduce ecosystem impacts is important. And then we got to decide if we want seafood from the ocean, we're going to have an impact. How do we manage that impact? And what are the trade-offs? Thanks a lot, everybody.